Good evening. Hi to everybody. It's a pleasure for me be here today for this seminar, this webinar, co-organized by Sant'Anna, Sant'Anna Legal Studies, and Università degli Studi di Milano. The topic of today's webinar is the very famous book, we can say in this way, not yet maybe, but yes, the very famous book, Democracy in Times of Pandemic. And first of all, I would like to say that I not agree on the title of the seminar, because the title of the seminar is Democracy in Times of a Pandemic. And for me, this is a clear underevaluation of the importance of the second line of the title, Different Futures Imagined. Because as the authors and the editors, Professor Maduro and Professor Khan, say in the introduction, and it's quite clear if you read some of the essays in the book, the book is not only about what happened to democracy during the pandemic. Okay, we are still in the pandemic, but they try because it's so difficult to reason about this now. They try to think what can happen after the pandemic times to democracy and other issues examined in this book. And in fact, this book is a book about today, but about future. So this is the reason why maybe also the title of the seminar should have been different. But I know, you know, all the fault is to Giuseppe Martinico for this. We can all of us agree.
As always
on this point. So having said this, and I really would like to not to cut time for our speakers, but let me thank all of them. Miguel Poiares Maduro, who is the editor, one of the two editors of the book. Antonia Baraggia, State University of Milan, who is also the co-organizer of the meeting. Joelle Grogan, Middlesex University, London. András Jakab, University of Salzburg, and of course Giuseppe Martinico, my friend and colleague. We will start with a sort of keynote speech by Miguel Poiares Maduro. So 20 minutes, Professor Maduro, 25 if you like it. And please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking Giuseppe, first of all, for having promoted this, but thank in particular all of you, Professor Raffaele Torino that moderates, and all the different speakers, not only for participating, but for hopefully at least having read the book that they are going to comment. And I hope that you will enjoy it, that you have enjoyed it. And let me say that it's a great pleasure too to have the opportunity to be in contact with several friends that are online and whom I have not had the opportunity recently, for reasons that are well known for all of us, to be in touch with. Let me say that that I agree with what Professor Raffaele Torino was saying, that in fact the purpose of the book is not so much to discuss democracy in times of pandemic, but to look at democracy in times of pandemic with a view to discuss democracy beyond the pandemic, to look at the impact of how the practice of democracy during the pandemic will impact on democracy beyond the pandemic, including with respect to many issues that were already dominant and very important issues that democracies were facing. We actually start the introduction to the book. That is a book of collected essays that I edited with Paul Kahn. But we start our long introduction that is meant to be an introduction to the topic, and not simply and not even mainly an introduction to the different essays. Is supposed to stand on its own as an independent paper and a broader paper on the challenges that democracy is facing. But we started actually with a metaphor that tries to emphasize that by reminding that most movies about the apocalypse rarely are about the apocalypse themselves. They focus on what follows the apocalypse, on what structures of society, the economy, and politics result from the apocalypse. And to a certain extent, that's what we are trying to do in this book, is to think about how the practice of democracy in this context of the pandemic will impact on what democracy will look like in the future. And we did that with an additional challenge that was to write the book while the pandemic was in its early stages. The book was written, both the introduction and the other essays, just before the summer. And I think it's interesting to read the book today and see that some of the things that we were anticipating actually seem to be demonstrating itself. Some of the ways, even including some of the aspects that look more hopeful to democracy in the early stages of the pandemic, nowadays perhaps, unfortunately, look more challenging to democracy. Now, we start by identifying the multiple emergencies that result from the pandemic to democracy, and the different potential sources of challenges to democracy that result from those emergencies. It is well known, I mean, it's a fact, that COVID-19, the pandemic, is first of all a public health emergency like none that our generation has lived before. Past generations have had equal or even more serious public health emergencies. But from the point of view of our generation, it is a crisis like no other. But this public health emergency then raises a variety of issues regarding democracy, the practice of democracy, democratic governance. Issues that regard the balance between expert advice and political incentives, political pressure, the role of experts in democracy, and the extent to which the need to rely on science and expertise becomes more and more important, has become more and more important as the pandemic has progressed. But at the same time, the fear of the pandemic, the extent to which the fear of the pandemic and the despair that it generates also starts then affecting the reliance on that expertise and the relationship on that expertise. And the extent to which this makes this relationship between expertise and democratic authority not static but dynamic throughout the pandemic. And I think this has been very clear. There have been moments where it has seemed as the pandemic will enhance more trust in experts and in science, and will increase the role and the relevance of science in democratic processes. There have been other moments where it has seemed like if the pandemic could further undermine trust in experts and science that was already challenged, particularly by populist movements throughout the world, including in Europe. Now, at the same time, we know that the pandemic, beyond a health emergency, will also be a social and economic emergency. That this will bring about distrust on the political process. Again, there initially it might have brought further trust in the political process, but now it might lead to less trust in the political process, and that this is in turn also linked to the fact that it also become a public opinion emergency as well. And it raises issues on how public opinion is formed, on how the collective will is formed in democracy. Now, the social and economic dimensions in turn also raise important and fundamental redistributive questions in our societies, and it would also further put stress on the output legitimacy of our democracies, the extent to which they will be able to answer to the needs, the wishes of the people. And in that context, while challenging social contracts on which our political communities might exist, they also, in other respects, might change the ethos, the political ethos of institutions such as the European Union. If the economic and social crisis resulting from the pandemic is itself a political and democratic challenge, it has also presented an opportunity for the European Union, for example, to redefine its ethos. If this will be successful, and if it will be more permanent or transitory, it's something that is still open to discussion. And in this context, it also becomes clear that the pandemic has pushed for a broader reconsideration of the nature of the political and of the polity. The pandemic has taught us the extent to which we are interdependent, to which for us to be safe, others have to be safe. But it also, as I said, will raise important questions of redistribution and reward that may, on the other hand, change that relational character within the polity, to whom we have a duty of care in the context of the pandemic, not only within our political community, but with respect to other political communities. How do those responsibilities fall between the public and private actors, for example? And how may the pandemic redefine again the relationship between state and market, for example? These are all issues that the pandemic generates. Finally, the pandemic also generates a series of questions related to the digital organization of our society, to the use of data that is necessary to answer to the challenges of the pandemic, but that in turn raises a series of questions regarding privacy, regarding the role of artificial intelligence in our society. Now, all these challenges, all these questions raise themes that sometimes coincide, sometimes are different, sometimes overlap, sometimes point in different directions. And that we in the book, and as to the body of essays that compose the book, have organized under three themes: power, knowledge, and citizenship. We did this because we understand democracy as putting in relation citizenship with power and knowledge. And that, as a consequence, relationships between these different themes, between these different concepts, are necessarily at the core of the inquiries that we have to undertake on the nature of leadership, the role of expertise, institutions, and accountability and forms of responsibilities. Now, we have seen that this crisis, it's clear already, this pandemic crisis, in terms of power, has both left to claims of underreach, that is, that power has not done enough, for example, has not been effective in controlling the pandemic, has not been sufficiently effective in regulating collective behavior, but also, and not only regulating collective behavior, but also in providing to the needs of those that are affected by the pandemic, but also to claims of overreach, of abuse of power by leaders and institutions. Knowledge focused on the question of the importance of expert knowledge and its relationship with public opinion, the role of experts, the importance of experts in democracy, but also how public opinion is formed in an increasingly digital world. And finally, citizenship emerges in the context of the pandemic, both in terms of the claims for duties of care, that is, the claims that people make to be cared by others and by the state, but also emerges in the context of the responsibility that impose on all of us collectively and individually to act in the context of the pandemic. Now, all these three concepts, in our view, power, knowledge, and citizenship, are both in question and reconstructed by the experience of the pandemic. This said, it's still too early to know the extent to which much of the practice of democracy and much of the changes that are taking place on democracy during the pandemic will actually impact on the democracy beyond the pandemic. We try to anticipate that, but to a large extent, we also recognize that it's still too early to know if some of these changes, if some of these consequences will last or will go away as the pandemic also hopefully will go away. But what we know is that some of these challenges and some of these transformations may be new, while many others simply amplify or limit ongoing democratic transformations. Now, in the second part of my presentation to you, I want to focus on some of the issues in which, in our introduction, we address these questions that are raised. And the first one has to do with how we can make sense in terms of the consequences for how we organize ourselves politically in a democratic context of the fact that we were not prepared for the pandemic, that our political systems, that our governments were not prepared. I mean, you've all heard for sure the many instances in the past where experts, but also even political leaders, such as the former, almost all the former American presidents before Trump, had warned about the imminent risk of a pandemic, or how people such as Bill Gates had said 3-4 years before this pandemic that a pandemic was indeed the greatest risk humanity was facing, much more than any form of war. Yet, governments were not prepared. Moreover, they were not prepared in Europe when the risk of the pandemic was already quite clear, as the pandemic was expanding in China and beyond China. But because this failure was universal, it included almost any national government, any political power, we can't really attribute it to the shortcomings, to the personal failings of specific leaders or of specific regimes. It has to do with something that is in the nature of politics today. This systemic failure indicates that in the same way that we citizens, for example, suffer from optimism bias, also governments suffer from optimism bias and from a broader failure in integrating future risks into public policy planning. Democratic regimes, it's a lesson that results from this pandemic, will have to do a much better job of incorporating these future risks, and that includes and that must require incorporating science into their planning and policy choices. This has to be the case not only because of pandemics, but it also is the case already in other areas, such as the climate change, financial sustainability, in a variety of areas our political systems increasingly do a poor job of incorporating future risks into current day political and policy decisions. This is due for sure to a structural misalignment of benefits and costs that we explain in the introduction and in the book, that to a large extent, while the costs of these types of risks are future and hypothetical and therefore hard to measure and hard to feel, the costs, on the other hand, of the decisions necessary to prevent them are costs that will be paid politically today. And this misalignment explains the difficulty of our political systems in dealing with this. I mean, just imagine what would have happened if, or even we were talking already in December 2019, when the pandemic was already ravaging in China. Even at that moment, I would claim that if national governments in Europe would, for example, have frozen salaries in order to save financial resources and start spending already in preparing hospitals for the first wave, that very likely that will be the object of a severe political counter-reaction, and it would have been extremely hard for governments to do that. Now, we know that citizens need to feel, decide on the basis of what they feel, not on the basis of policy literacy, and therefore that makes it very hard for these decisions to be taken. This means that we probably will need to introduce further mechanisms that we have already in some domains that force the internalization of long-term risks into political systems. This may take the form of independent health and environmental agencies, for example. Should health agencies be more independent than they are, for example, in order to more rapidly alert and be in a position to put pressure on political systems to act preventively, independently from the political incentives of that moment. But it may also take the form of signaling instruments. We suggest, for example, the possibility of creating environmental or health ratings or alerts, in the same way that we have credit ratings that create ratings for environmental risks or health risks such as pandemic, that will help incorporate in the public discourse, into public opinion, a greater perception of the potential of these risks, and therefore try to lead public opinion to actually put pressure on the political system to act more preventively, to act early on. Now, this raises a broader issue that the pandemic promotes on the formation of collective will. We know that today our public sphere is increasingly digital, and the pandemic has represented and expressed the risks that exist in this digital sphere. The fact that, to a large extent, these risks are not in themselves new, but the way the digital public sphere operates amplifies these risks in a way that the sheer volume and the sheer scope that they take affects their own nature, a little bit like quantum physics. Quantity sometimes can change the nature of things too. And I think the risks of misinformation, the risks of polarization that are promoted in the digital public sphere, and of which this pandemic is a particular good example, are much bigger in that space. We know about that. We know how the way access to information takes place in the digital public sphere is challenging traditional authoritative sources of knowledge, what I call the editors of democracy. How this digital space promotes the creation of informational bubbles and therefore a stronger polarization, and makes it harder to form a collective will, to reach compromise, and feds instead polarize politics. and how misinformation expands and becomes much more insidious and dangerous through the digital sphere. Now, we've also seen the extent to which during this pandemic, and the way to address misinformation and these risks in the context of the pandemic, how that has now started to being transformed into a way of addressing these risks outside the pandemic in terms of political speech. But that has its own risks too, risks for which we alert. We should not necessarily assume that the way to regulate the risks of misinformation, for example, or polarization or informational bubbles in the context of the pandemic will necessarily is the right way to address these same risks in the context of political speech. In addition, the pandemic has made clear that the public space of opinion formation is no longer national in many respects. During the pandemic, we have seen how governments' policies were deeply impacted by comparison with results and policies taken in other states. There was a constantly comparison of data, governance by indicators, not only the national indicators, but the indicators in other states, and as a consequence, to draw conclusions on the policies of those other states and the extent to which they should be applied or not in our state. But on the other hand, the pandemic also made clear that these comparisons, while often effective in changing governmental behavior, and that is interesting of itself, also present risks because a lot of these comparisons were based on unreliable and incomparable data. There was no harmonization of data, for example, on how COVID deaths are accounted. And that explains why in some states, excess mortality rates are much higher with respect to COVID deaths than in other states. That probably has to do on how that is being accounted for, not only, but also apart from that. And there are many other respects. I mean, the number of infected people depends on testing capacity, for example. So if on the other hand, this pandemic is a lesson on the extent to which governance is increasingly subject to that international comparison of indicators and shaped by it, on the other hand, it also alerts us to the need to focus on the quality of the data that is used for this comparison and that is used for this governance by indicator. There were no clear criteria often put forward for such data, no harmonized criteria. Open access did not become the standard, contrary to many people had claimed and hoped for. Transparency and cooperation on this data remain aspirational in many respects. To a certain extent, we have a paradox where in a world where access to data has never been easier, data has never been so contested. And this again leads me to the issue of the role of science. As I said, if on the one hand governments' responses to the virus rely strongly on scientific expertise, as the pandemic progressed and science became to increasingly show that it could not provide the certainty that governments and citizens expect from it, because science is about probability. Science is about also testing, mistaking, and correcting. That tension, if initially there was a much stronger reliance on science, as the pandemic progressed, we have seen that turning around and increasingly challenges to science emerging, and increasingly populist politicians to actually use the response, or what some perceive as a lack of effective response to the pandemic, as an instrument to further erode confidence in science. Now, all this puts and raises important questions on how to organize the relationship between the public spheres of science and politics. That they do not, when they do not, I will say, when they will necessarily not coincide. The crisis has as much brought potential to bring them together as it has, in many respects, drive them further apart. Now, this question on the role of science is also linked to a larger ongoing crisis on democracy that is linked to the relationship between democracy and effectiveness. Now, it has both output and input dimensions that we know. On the output dimension is the extent to which democracy is increasingly no longer perceived as the system of governance that is most strongly equated with higher levels of economic growth and social justice. And for example, development and growth in China demonstrate that. And there is a risk that that will be enhanced in this context, particularly, for example, as China is coming out of the pandemic crisis faster, not only in terms of health emergency, but also in terms of economic recovery. The input dimension refers to the viability of democratic processes as a self-correcting political system. I mean, increasingly, democratic polities are perceived as deadlocked. And this is in turn perceived as protecting the status quo and protecting the elites that have thrive in that status quo. And these conditions, politics as for many people increasingly take place outside of formal political institutions, and politics outside formal political institutions, as we talk about it, are not subject to the institutional constraints that further rational deliberation, and they are instead the product of a rather different epistemological space, one where emotion trumps reason. And what we see actually with populism is that this form of politics that started to take place outside of formal political institutions, because these are perceived as being deadlocked and controlled by a particular set of interests, how this form of politics outside the traditional political institutions is brought into that political system through populist forces. Now, if in the initial phase, again, as a little bit like it happened with science and experts, the pandemic seemed to have reinforced trust in existing political authorities because, as it always happens, when people are faced with exogenous shock, they rally behind the flag. As the pandemic progressed, and that was something that we were alerting and that I think we are seeing, and as the health emergency turns from into a social and economic crisis, this trust is unlikely to continue. In fact, we are seeing it increasingly being eroded, and therefore, what might initially have been an instrument to re-establish trust in traditional political institutions, in traditional political actors, and in those traditional editors of democracy, and therefore in a more rational form of democratic deliberation, is likely to lead instead to stronger challenges to that form of conception of democracy and to an increased role of populist forces, an increased emotional form of politics. Now, at the same time, this will depend on the impact that the pandemic crisis will have on our own concept of ourselves as citizens. And some of the chapters in the book are particularly interesting in that respect, notably those of Susan Neiman, Weiler, or Calypso Nicolaidis. Some optimistic, others more pessimistic. And again, because the reason for that is because, again, in that respect, the pandemic can both have a positive and a negative impact. Some see indications that the pandemic might have led to new practices of citizenship, both new political processes of citizenship, but also, as for example, Susie Neiman stresses, a less self-interest dependent practice of citizenship. But on the other hand, the pandemic is increasingly showing to the problems with our existing and dominant concept of citizenship, because it has taught us a lesson on how collective responsibility is hard to develop, particularly in the second and third wave. Free riding becomes rampant. Cleavages have started to emerge within societies between those that wanted to accept greater and lesser risk, depending on whether they themselves, for example, depending on generation, the old and the young, are more or less subject to the risks of the virus. And increasingly, those cleavages also translate into economic and social cleavages. And so, if initially we could say that the virus seemed to be nurturing our collective bonds and improving forms of solidarity and mutual responsibility, as the pandemic has progressed, self-interest conceptions seem to have gained ground again. Finally, as to the exercise of power, and particularly in the context where emergency powers were claimed. One can see both a pessimist and a negative view on the impact of the crisis. For pessimists, there are three different risks that have emerged. First, and as I mentioned already, possible perception that authoritarian regimes have been more effective in addressing the crisis, looking at countries such as China. Though that is not necessarily the case, because if we look at other authoritarian regimes, that is not necessarily so. But the risk is that if that will turn, depending on what will become the normative narrative in this respect, this might undermine further trust in democratic leadership, because it will further undermine trust in the effectiveness of democracy as a system of government. Second, we have seen the extent to which populists have made use of extraordinary powers that are necessary to address certain aspects of the pandemic crisis to further erode the principles of liberal democracy. We've seen that in some European states. And third, there is a fear of a resurgence of nationalism, as some politicians blame other nations and immigrants for the pandemic. This seemed curiously to have been an important fear in the beginning, but interestingly, the European answer so far has been able to resist to these more protectionist nationalists, at least within the European Union. Though it will be interesting to see what will happen if, for example, a country like the United Kingdom, just at Brexit, indeed manages to have a much more successful and fast vaccination strategy than the ones of the countries in the European Union. There are some in Brexiteers that are already claiming that the greatest initial success, at least of the United Kingdom, it's possible because they are not part of the European Union. So we have to be prepared for this narrative to be used. But on the other hand, and to conclude, it is possible to also have a narrative of optimism of the current pandemic crisis on democracy. This is linked to the renewed awareness of our relational nature that I've mentioned already, and points at examples of profound stories of solidarity that have emerged within particular political communities and even between political communities. It also points at the increased support for political elites, and therefore enhanced trust on those political elites, but also on media and experts. And therefore, the renewed role this might lead to in terms of science and the role of science in democracy. It also points at the practices of increasing demands for transparency and public disclosure of information on the part of citizens, and the extent to which they've been successful in part. And if we look at all these elements, it is also possible to develop a narrative of optimism whereby this pandemic could help us in rebuilding a democracy that is more strongly connected with reason, with pluralism, with the civic ethos, and with liberal constitutionalism. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Maduro, for this extensive introduction to your book. I think that it will help a lot the following speakers. Your introduction, for me, clearly expresses the idea that your book is a very ambitious book, and for me it's quite impressive that you succeeded in so short time in putting this first step, because I can consider this a first step in your research, a first brick in your research, because as you told, a lot of things are still still to be evaluated and investigated. But time is running, and I will give immediately the floor to Antonia Baraggia, State University of Milan, Università Statale di Milano, and we will collect all the questions at the end. Okay? Thank you. Antonia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Torino, and thank you, Professor Martinico, for having invited me. I'm very pleased to be part of this panel discussing democracy in times of pandemic. The book gathers some of the most outstanding scholars in the field of law, sociology, religion, and politics. And the three sections of the book, Power, Knowledge, and Citizens, really unpacked the most compelling issue that the pandemic brought into the field of the studies on democracy at national and transnational level. As already Professor Torino said, I really appreciate the long-term post-pandemic perspective of the book. In fact, many contributions have tried to address the present challenges from the perspective of an imagined future. And among the many important issues covered by the book, in my brief comment, I would like to concentrate on two main points, mainly addressed by the third part of the book on the transformative impact of the pandemic on the relation between citizens and institutions. Most of the contribution of the third part of the book emphasized the role of humanity and the centrality of human condition in all the discourse about democracy and democratic participation. It may appear to be an oxymoron. While confronting with an unprecedented phenomenon on a global scale, a truly global moment involving transformation of power, governance, economics, we are focusing on the human dimension of individuals. But I think this is not an oxymoron at all. The pandemic has highlighted a kind of globalization of human condition. Citizens from all over the world, from the west to east, from the north to south, are experiencing for the first time probably a similar condition. And even public authorities, from well-functioning democracy to more weak regime, are struggling in order to manage and to control what seems to be very hard to fully govern. As Professor Nicolaidis argues in one of the contributions of the book, the pandemic has raised the awareness that politics and scientists cannot guarantee our safety. The pandemic moment has highlighted the relational nature and the independence of the human relationship. And from this new awareness, we can design new forms of democratic participation, of self-government, even of transnational democracy. And I like this quotation from Professor Nicolaidis' contribution. I'm quoting, whatever local idiosyncrasies, our modernity has produced the same condition across the globe. People demand to be in control of their destiny and deny the state a monopoly on the rules of togetherness. The unprecedented intimate globality brought about by this pandemic is only beginning to expose the power of a deeper universal, our democratic imagination. The same focus on the human condition can be found in Professor Joelle's contribution, which addresses the impact of the pandemic on democracy from the particular angle of the European Union and the European states, especially those which are experiencing the rise of populist regimes. Joelle argues that the pandemic has exacerbated and accentuated the long-standing problems of democracy in and of Europe. In particular, the failure of the European citizenship project is central to the European democratic deficit, and it has become more evident during the COVID-19 management. At least in the first stage of the European response to the pandemic, the discussion about the European measure to fight the crisis was centered on the national perspective. It was a discussion about the Dutch, the Italians, the Spanish, not a discourse of solidarity among fellow European citizens. Under this perspective, I must say that the more recent developments, so the approval of the Next Generation EU, may represent a step toward a more European common management of the crisis. Of course, with regard to this, the issue of the still missing European taxation power, at least a significant taxation power, is key, and this still remains a flaw of the entire system, based, as Joelle argues, on representation without taxation. And I completely share the point of Professor Maduro that the pandemic can be an opportunity of the EU to redefine its aims. But the pandemic has also shown that economic factors cannot give an exhaustive explanation to people's distrust and discontent towards the democratic institutions. And I really like another point made by Joelle. And he postulates that the human condition, I'm quoting, is such that each of us consciously or subconsciously seeks to satisfy not only material needs, but metaphysical ones. And among them, the wish or the need to give significance and meaning to our short lives, a significance and a meaning that goes beyond that which serves our own self-interest. Values play a role in satisfying the primordial drive. And it is here that we find another deficit in the ways we have articulated and come to understand the values of Europe. And beside what he defined as the holy trinity of values, democracy, rule of law, and human rights, and Joelle argues that we need to add what he calls the unholy trinity of values: patriotism, duties, beside that rights, and the respect for collective identities and culture. Among this thought-provoking argument, I would like to elaborate a little on the couple duties and rights, particularly on the pan-European culture of rights, which I think that without doubt, right protection is one of the brightest achievements of the European legal space. However, this pandemic momentum has shown that a polity built only on a culture of rights is a polity built on the sand. In fact, since February 2020, we witnessed in our everyday life a constant violation, or at least the limitation of our fundamental rights in the name of the response to the pandemic. Privacy, freedom of movement, right to education, and even the core freedom of the European construct are now put on hold because of the pandemic. And moreover, the idea that the diffusion of a pan-European human rights discourse could have helped to save the European constitutional path, creating popular commitment and recognition within the EU, has revealed to be quite an illusion. Human rights adjudication, despite having, of course, a unifying effect, may also contribute to redefine the boundaries of social conflicts, having the potential also to exacerbate them and to ultimately having a divisive effect. And the focus on rights and their judicialization on one side further marginalize the political and representative domain, exacerbating this way the European democratic deficit, and on the other, helps to frame rights discourse in terms of merely individual claims without any reference to questions of duty and solidarity. Moreover, besides this hyper-individualization, the pan-European rights discourse also has the potential to cause a flattening of political and cultural specificity of one's own unique national identity, ending also a powerful argument to populist and anti-European campaigns. That's why I really like the suggestion of the contribution of this book to consider the pandemic as a chance to rediscover and revitalize a Republican conception of citizenship, to overcome the tyranny of the self-interest, as pointed out by Susan Neiman, and ultimately to reimagine democracy in a post-pandemic world. This is even more important in time of limited resources, both financial and environmental, which will require the public institution to make redistributive choices to redefine our commitment to social justice. So in the end, this book fosters us to think creatively about the future of our democracy and to imagine a new beginning for our democratic institution. I stop here for the moment, and I must say that I really enjoy in reading this book. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonia Baraggia. I'm sure that your observation triggered a lot of further observation by Professor Maduro, but we can switch this to the end. And now the next speaker should be Joelle Grogan, but I'm not sure that she's online. Joelle, are you online?
She should be.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Okay. Thank you, Joelle. So Joelle Grogan is from Middlesex University of London, and please, Joelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So first off, I really want to commend the editors and also the authors of this fantastic book. It reminds me a lot of a Netflix series that I had just discovered, and I think we all know the joy of discovering a new series in the ordinary academic privileged monotony of living in pandemic. But every essay was certainly an episode in and of itself that could be watched and rewatched, and also within the context of an overall series. I also recognize I pushed that metaphor a little too far, but
we want to know that series.
I was going to say Tiger King, but I thought that would be pushing it really too far. But no, I actually want to pick up on something that Professor Maduro began with, both in the context of the presentation today, but also in the book, this idea that we don't look at the event, but we look at the aftermath. And we're almost living in a very strange continuum of both being still in the event and also living the aftermath. I know in the context of Europe, a majority of states are still relying on either emergency provisions, states of emergency, or otherwise powers that are not ordinary and are not being used in an ordinary sense. But even pushing that further, only a minority of states in Europe are looking forward to exiting emergency, trying to communicate to their citizens how to exit and look beyond this. I know in the context of my own research that this is not an unusual trend, that even in countries such as, for example, Thailand, that had an initial very good reaction, we're still looking at now sudden emergency provisions. We're still living the event, not yet the aftermath. What I thought I'd do, just in the context of my own discussion of this, again, fantastic Netflix series, that's the last time I'll make that reference, is pick up on mainly some of the themes to do with power and institutions and institutional structures. One very common theme I saw among many of contributors, not only in the introduction, but also in terms of the conversation of Kim Lane Chapla and David Posen, was the idea that this was a natural experiment on a global scale. And there's certainly a reality in that. I know that I've had the privilege of almost running this experiment in the context of looking at global reactions in 75 countries at the beginning, that initial reaction in March and April, and now a year later. And there's something that really is important throughout this book, which is the idea that this does or could or should represent a shift, a very important shift. And how almost can we influence and think and consider this shift? I'm almost reminded of that fantastic quotation of the inaugural poet yesterday at President Biden's inauguration, that for while we have the eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us. But one of the very important things, almost from the beginning, and again, this was brought out in Professor Maduro's highlighting, was the idea that there's a lot of very difficult conflicts between different positions at play, that we have a lot of different interests that are being balanced, and a lot of different conversations at the level of governance, what kind of conversations that we should be having. One very standout point for me from the very beginning is the idea that there is no stable point of compromise, that we are continuing to have the same conversations as to what expertise is and what it means, the division, almost the pitting of expertise against democratic governance and accountability, of experts and politics, even of disease and economy. These are conversations that are not only being heightened in the context of rising infection rates, not only here in Europe, but also throughout the world, but also again going forward. I think one of the fantastic things that was drawn out so much throughout all three parts of this book is again the reconsideration of relationships, the reconsideration of relationships between states and citizens, between institutions, even between the responsibilities of those unsocial networks. That was a terrible joke. I won't make that again. And also the idea of responsibility and accountability. So a few things that I just want to pick up on is actually this idea of the expectations that we are making of governance. Again, there was a fantastic point brought out by Walker, but also by Professor Maduro and by numerous others on this idea that where we are in consideration of the aftermath, where we are in consideration of how well our systems have responded to this pandemic, this idea of what almost the bias we have, this omniscience bias, that we can look back on all the failures of government. But again, one of the key things that we need to remember in the context of any kind of comparison between states is, again, how problematic that is. Now, I know, again, in the context of my own research, that I've been forwarding these good principles of good governance, these good ways of going forward. And again, we see those recommendations throughout the book. How should we respond to this? What kind of reformulation of the systems should we be looking at? But one of the difficulties is we're not quite sure yet, potentially, how to really measure who has done the best and who has done the worst. What is failure when all we have is what is in front of us right now? To again echo Professor Maduro, it's very difficult, if not problematic, to be comparing infection rates, mortality rates, or even systems of governance. I'm reminded in this context that while Thailand had a very, very strong reaction initially that led to very, very low infection rates reported, we can't just look at response to pandemic. There are other indicators. There are other considerations that we will increasingly need to be considering. In this context of looking at governance, of evaluating governance, which is essential in reforming, it's essential in trying to find that better system, those better institutions to respond not only to the current ongoing pandemic, but those future emergencies, those future man-made emergencies, or those future unexpected natural emergencies. And I recognize there's a lot of conversations to be had there. Ironically, when I was looking back over my notes of this book, I was reminded of what was in an email signature to me today, which was actually coincidentally from a French contributor talking about states of emergency in France. It was ne rien prévenu sinon l'imprévise, ne rien attend sinon l'attendu. Forgive my terrible accent. I haven't had enough coffee. But essentially, for me, it was summing up so much of the expectations that we have on governance, that we expect our systems to be able to adapt to things that are unexpected, to be able to foresee things that are unforeseeable. And in the context of this, I just want to focus in on three of the pessimistic concerns that Professor Maduro highlighted as being discussed in very interesting. I did disagree with some parts of this, but I won't go there. But three of the major concerns or pessimistic outlooks, and just layer that with what we are seeing now. So what in my own little international global experiment we're seeing. So there's three concerns of autocracy and democracy, of the increasing rise of nationalism, of response, and also of the idea of the autocratization of states, the end of liberal democracy. Now, first, in the context of authoritarian responses and democratic responses, I'm familiar with all the arguments that autocracies or autocratic governments have fared better. And I would echo and affirm what Professor Maduro has highlighted, which is that's simply not true. In fact, one of the fallacies of current conversation in the context of response to pandemic is that we are saying autocracy and democracy are opposing sides of the same spectrum. That's not true. We have a very wide variety of different autocratic responses and democratic responses. What we can say is that the single most powerful indicator of a more positive response, insofar as we can say that with all the problematic conditions attached to it, is public trust. It's an urgent reaction, a very quick reaction, and public trust in the measures of compliance. What we also tend to see is that countries with higher levels of public trust have also tended to be democracies. Not to say that there's not critical issues, and I look in this context to New Zealand and to Australia. There are critical issues being highlighted in the context of accountability and the accountability of the decisions that are being made. But second, in the context of nationalism, we're certainly seeing an insular response globally. But as we move forward, especially in the context of vaccines, the conversation is going to be moving to international response, international coordination, international moving forward to economic recovery. I would say in this context, that is one concern that's still powerful to me. In the context of vaccine equity, for example, we're not seeing vaccines anywhere, well, in a much minor way in the global south, particularly in Africa. Finally, just in the context of autocratization, because I've realized with horror that I'm going over time. This is just because, again, it's a Netflix series that I don't want to stop talking about. But a last point, just in the context of autocratization, this concern that this is a cause for further democratic deconsolidation. The one thing that we can say with certainty, and this is something that I saw not only within the introduction in the context of power, but also running through a number of the series, that's the last time, a number of the chapters, that this is not a cause of autocratization, but it is a catalyst. It's a moment where we're seeing certain forms of government not changing their spots, but using this as an opportunity to further the consolidation of power within the executive. As a last point, this is a fantastic book and a needed one. And I think it has brought two important points, standing here in the middle of the event and the aftermath, giving it both an urgency of reading, but also I think a longevity. I look forward to the most optimistic outlooks within the book becoming a reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Joelle, for your enthusiastic consideration about the book. I think that Professor Maduro will really appreciate it, and also the authors and the other editor. And now the floor is to András Jakab from University of Salzburg. András, are you with us?
Yes, thank you so much for the invitation to discuss this excellent book. I had great pleasure to when I read it in the last couple of days, and certain chapters I was just kind of a naive new reader, especially the parts on theological or moral philosophical issues, and the parts that I can really use also in the future in my research are about constitutional issues. And I'm also going to concentrate in the next couple of minutes on these issues. I think that what we can say is that the pandemic was, or actually is, it has been a big stress test or a shock test for constitutional democracies, actually not just for constitutional democracies, but also for authoritarian regimes. And I agree what the editors wrote in the introduction is that one of the dangers or one of the traps or problems that we can face when we talk about these issues is the danger of hindsight. So afterwards, we are always very smart. So afterwards, we know what should have been done at the moment, but whatever is chosen, later it's much easier to find good solutions than at the moment. So even though content-wise or as a matter of fact, it's probably very right to criticize what went wrong, but I would also be a bit more forgiving about the mistakes that were committed by politicians all around the world. I think it's not just about this danger of hindsight doesn't just simply apply on what should have been done, but it also applies on the more generic question of what is going to remain from the pandemic. So whether these changes that we see in the political system, in the narratives about our political community or in constitutional law, whether they remain with us or not. The truth is that we actually don't know. And afterwards, whatever happens, it will be very obvious that should have that happened, and then it will be clear that no other option was possible. But before that, or when we are sitting in the situation, I think it's very often much less clear. Especially three topics. There were three topics that I found interesting in the book. One was about the growing role of state intervention. The second is about the role of expert advice in democracy, and also in the introduction, Miguel talked about it in detail. And the third one is the various constitutional issues that can be discussed in the context of the pandemic. And I personally found most instructive three chapters from the book. One was from Roberto Gargarella on the South American or Latin American experience of how unchecked discretion can pose a risk for the constitutional system. The other chapter, which I really found instructive, was written by Olivier Beau basically on a trade-off between political and legal accountability in France. So if political accountability doesn't work properly, then there is a structural pressure that legal accountability, basically trials, will be conducted against ministers also in these situations. And finally, the paper by Kim Lane-Chappell and David Posen, which is probably conceptually the most innovative paper. They talk about executive overreach in emergency situations, and that's the usual narrative, or that's the usual way how we conceptualize the dangers of emergency situations, that the executive is basically abusing the exceptional powers, and then they use it for purposes that were not meant to be used for, or that they kind of fall in love with these executive powers and they don't want to stop the emergency situation. And that's a usual topic. They also mention it, but the focus of the paper is on something else, which I found really illuminating. That was the executive underreach. And executive underreach is when the executive and the government is not doing in an emergency situation what it is supposed to do. So not overdoing it, but actually not doing what they could do. I don't know, if they bring the example that imagine that, you know, a neighboring country is beginning a war against your country, and instead of mobilizing the army, actually the government is not doing anything but thinking about what to do, or consciously avoiding any action against it. And they say that something similar has actually happened in the United States, partly in Brazil, but especially in the United States, when the Trump government had more possibilities legally that they have actually used, or what they have used, they used it too late, and they were actually aware of their possibilities, and they were aware of that they should have done it, but they didn't do it because of popularity considerations or the considerations for certain stakeholders. And I think this is a very good point. It's very innovative. I myself, I haven't read about this issue before. So the problem of not using the powers by the executive in an emergency situation, and I think that's a problem that is going to stay in, or that's a concept that is going to stay long term in constitutional doctrine. So that was kind of my favorite point, probably in the book, that I can really use also in the future. A few more points I have written down when I read the book, which are partly just questions, partly dilemmas, and partly certain theses that I would like to basically put on the floor, so we can discuss them, that were inspired by reading this book. The first point that I have 5 points. First one is that I think the fundamental dilemma of state of emergency, and we are talking in a legal sense here, state of emergency, is always to strike an appropriate balance between effectivity in managing the threat and the protection of constitutional state from the abuse of emergency powers. This is the traditional way how we conceive it. But this usual dilemma that you find always in the literature on state of emergency cannot really explain the issue of executive underreach. So I think this concept is also inspiring, because the traditional structures in constitutional doctrine have to be rethought in a way. So how you balance the abuse? There is no abuse in these situations, but still that's a constitutional problem. So this is an irritating but very useful concept that I think we should use in the future when we talk about state of emergency in general. The second is that in various constitutional systems you have always varying degrees of detailedness. So how many rules you have, or how detailed the rules are about emergency situations, and there is no generic answer how detailed these rules should be, because partly these how detailed the rules are inspired by historical experiences, and I'm pretty sure that now that the world went through this pandemic, there will be also rules, at least in some constitutional systems, also for situations of constitutional underreach. But so far, they haven't existed. So the detailedness of these rules always depends on historical experience. So in that sense, what we see now in real life, there is a good chance that in the next couple of years we will see consequences of the pandemic in various constitutional texts, also concerning executive underreach. The third point that I would like to mention is that when we interpret rules or situations of state of emergency, we should always bear in mind the purpose of state of emergency. And I mean, in general, I'm a big fan of purposive interpretation or teleological interpretation, and I think in many cases where we are unsure also about how to interpret these rules, it is very helpful to consider what is the actual purpose of the state of emergency, and I think, or in my understanding, that the purpose of state of emergency is always a return to the normal constitutional status, so the normal state. If we consider that, then in many cases where the rules are unclear, I mean, this can be helpful for the interpretation of unclear rules. The fourth point, that's more of a question, which is behind some of the analysis in this book, but also in the literature in general, is that what are we actually protecting in a state of emergency? Is it just really the state or the political community or the lives of people, or do we want to protect something else? Do we want to protect the constitutional system as such, or maybe the fundamental rights, or a constitutional system based on fundamental rights? Because if we have different objects or different purposes that we want to protect, then it has consequences on what kind of rules, constitutional rules, we should have for these emergency situations, and how we should interpret them. And very often this is not explicit. So you read the text and then you kind of guess what is actually behind it. So what's the real purpose, what we want to protect. And the final point is that in emergency situations, we normally, I mean, we expect from an emergency situation two things. So we define emergency situations by 2 points. One is that there should be an urgency, so quickly you need to act. And second, you need to do something unusual, or the usual measures are not sufficient. And normally we suppose that it is the executive which is able to do that. I mean, legislature is normally slower, and courts are normally more punctual, so they can decide in certain individual cases in general. And actually, also Kimley, Scheppele, and Professor Posen, David Posen, challenged this perception, and they also refer to another study, which I also recommend to those who are listening to us now. It's a study by Tom Ginsberg and Mila Persteg. They also say that it is a misconception that in emergency situations only the executive has a role, because as a matter of fact, and Ginsberg and Versteeg also check it empirically or quantitatively, as they very often do. As a matter of fact, also courts played quite a strong role in the pandemic, partly by restraining the executive action, and partly actually in certain situations, for example in Brazil, actually substituting the executive action. But on the other hand, we also have to see that courts are normally shy in these situations, or they exercise a certain judicial self-restraint. An example could be actually from Austria, where I am now. I'm sitting actually in Vienna. So where the Constitutional Court struck down executive legislation from the spring time of the pandemic, but they did so basically at the end of the year, by December. And it's, I mean, to me, this is how I understand the situation, and this is how most commentators understand the situation. It was pretty clear that certain government decrees in Austria were also unconstitutional in the spring, but they were afraid to act because it was also at that time pretty clear, it was not clear actually also medically how dangerous the situation is and how grave it will be. And they wanted to use this hindsight advantage. They wanted to wait until the end of the year, and then they told us that the way our fundamental rights were actually limited by government decrees in the spring was unconstitutional. And I think this is in a way typical of for the attitude of courts, and I think also understandable. So if you want to keep the kind of the authority of the courts, then it's very dangerous to act in emergency situations, because you just don't have the the expert background and the bureaucracy that the executive has. So even though the generic picture of the executive emphasis of state of emergency is challenged, I see the point, but I have certain doubts about that. I think also in the future there are some points where courts can act, where courts can substitute executive action, but I think it is more the exception than the generic rule. So also in the future we actually need executive action, and I can't see so far a really good solution for the problem of executive underreach. So it is a puzzling issue. So that was it, and thank you again. Congratulations to the authors and the editors, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you to András for your consideration. Now we have our last speaker, but please, Giuseppe, be sure to keep your 10 minutes, because the time is very, very, very late, and I would like to save some time for a few questions and a final answer from Miguel Poiares Maduro. So please, Giuseppe, the floor is yours, 10 minutes.
Okay, thanks indeed, Raffaele. I'll do my best. Many thanks to Miguel and all the other friends. It is really great to be here. My colleagues have already raised super interesting questions, so I'm going to limit myself to some general considerations. And I would like to start by saying that I really liked the book, a volume that has the merit of covering many topics and paving the way for a useful and interdisciplinary debates between scholars from different disciplines. I have 4 points, and I'm going to focus on the first 2 parts of the book mainly. The first point concerns the role of social media platforms in times of populism. The pandemic has, on the one hand, revealed some of the fallacies of populists, but on the other hand, it has paradoxically reinforced the direct link between populist leaders and the masses. I'm thinking of the emergence of a transnational no-vax movement, for instance, which has reinforced the new populist, let's say, wave. Populist leaders question not only what they call the mainstream narrative, but also scientific evidence. Think of the Trump-Fauci relationship, for instance. In this sense, Nadia Urbinati once coined the term objectocracy to explain the relationship between disinformation and the populism. The term was used to describe the approach of the 5-star movement, but it applies, I would say, to President Trump, or to former President Trump better, too. Populists, in her view, vindicate a true or objective assessment of problems against opinionated media and established journalism. In this way, populists tend to create a kind of counter-narrative, and it is not by chance that scholars have spoken of a sort of pandemic techno-populism in this respect. So my question for Miguel is, what can we do as intellectuals and academics to combat this information disorder? I don't want to enter the very sensitive terrain of the debate on censorship and social media platforms, but I'm curious to know your view. Second point, my second point is about the link between pandemic and climate change. This is a relevant matter in terms of intergenerational justice, as you said. It is an issue that brings us back to the noble debate between Jefferson and Madison. Who owns the earth? Does the earth belong to the living or the dead? This is also a very important issue from an economic point of view. Think of the public debt created to deal with the pandemic in many countries. In some countries, the sovereignist, Italy is a good example, reject the use of the European stability mechanism, arguing that the European stability mechanism would be a kind of Trojan horse to erode sovereignty and democracy. But such a debate ignores or neglects the fact that intergenerational justice and the question of the sustainability of public debt are crucial issues for the future of our democracies. My third point is about the relationship between emergency and exception. And I'm gonna build upon what András already said. Emergencies are not necessarily states of exception. Of course, here I'm referring to Kashmir. Exception refers, in Agamben's words, to a kinematic state. A kinematic comes from the Greek and refers to a legal vacuum, an emptiness and standstill of the law. While contemporary constitutional law shows that emergencies can be governed by legal norms, particularly by constitutional norms. And comparative law offers different models in this respect. Among the legal systems equipped with explicit emergency clauses, there are examples which provide for a sort of gradual approach, depending on the type of emergency at stake. Spain is a very telling example of that. Article 116 of the Spanish Constitution identifies 3 different kinds of emergency, which they differ in the role of parliament and in terms of impact on fundamental rights: the state of alarm, the state of exception, and the state of siege. Something similar can be found even in other jurisdictions, Germany, France, to a certain extent. On the other side of the spectrum, there are quasi-silent constitutions, like the Italian one, which never employs the term emergency and does not provide for special schemes applicable to exceptional situations other than war. In Italy, the Constituent Assembly decided not to mention emergency light of the ghost, if you want, of the Weimar Republic. And that choice was motivated by the need to avoid abuses of emergency powers. However, I believe that the strategy of silence cannot entirely rule out scenarios of abuse by political power. And my question to Miguel is, what do you think about that? Do you think that constitutional law should have a say about the definition and regulation of the emergency? And if the answer is yes, do you think that the toolbox of constitutional lawyers can be adapted to pandemics, or are pandemics different from the classic types of emergency, like terrorism or natural disasters? I'm asking this question because according to some scholars, here we should move from the paradigm of emergency to the paradigm of risk. And this leads me to my final point number 4. Some years ago, in his book, The Constitution of Risk, Adrian Vermeulen described constitutions as risk management devices by distinguishing 2 competing paradigms of constitutionalism: precautionary constitutionalism and optimizing constitutionalism. While according to precautionary constitutionalism implies, some quoting him, that constitutional rule makers and citizens design and manage political institutions with a view to warding off the worst case. Optimizing constitutionalism instead trades off all relevant political risks, giving them their due weight in the circumstances without any systematic skew or bias against any particular type of political risk. Now, this approach was actually part of a broader reflection in the US about the limits of the precautionary principle. I'm thinking of Constantine, for instance. But in my opinion, this distinction that between precautionary and optimizing constitutionalism can be useful to, let's say, explain the different approaches to the pandemic. Precaution is a key word in the speeches of some political leaders, especially those who have decided to adopt different rounds of lockdown. For instance, if you look at some speeches given by Giuseppe Conte before the Italian parliamentary chambers, you will see that he has insisted a lot on this word. But the premise of precautionary constitutionalism approach is the existence of a sort of hierarchy of constitutional goods. According to this scheme, indeed, in order to protect some goods that are more important than others, the legal system should accept a possible constitutional loss. Make no mistake, here I'm not referring to the question of striking a balance, because balancing proportionality would protect, let's say, the essence of the competing goods at stake. Here we are talking about the possibility of losing one of the two competing goods. In order to preserve right to health, I accept, an economic loss, to accept, to lose something in terms of exercise of some other fundamental freedom. So here the decision indeed is that to sacrifice a good in order to protect health at a time of scientific uncertainty. At the first sight, this approach, precautionary constitutionalism, seems to be effective because it reduces social contact and favors social distancing. But at the same time, it creates high economic losses and fosters resentment in a time of populism. So it seems to me that the approach of precautionary constitutionalism is not sustainable in the long run. And my question for you is, can we say that the pandemic has demonstrated the inadequacy or insufficiency of precautionary constitutionalism? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Giuseppe. Only the answers to your question we request more than another couple of hours, I think, and we do not have so much time. So, but further to your question, I see that is only another question from Paolo Sandro. I don't know if Professor Maduro can see it, on the relationship between preparedness and democratic game. Maybe Paolo Sandro can better explain this question if he likes. Otherwise, I will give the final floor to to Professor Maduro.
Yeah, if Paolo can say a little bit more about what does it mean between the relationship between preparedness and democratic game. I think he's referring somehow to the last question of Giuseppe. Maybe
can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much to everyone. And the question relates to what Giuseppe was just saying, but quite in a bit different sense. What we have seen is that it's a matter of chance which government is in place when a pandemic strikes. And some countries were luckier than others in this respect, as clearly the approach and the efficacy of policy government. So in this respect, isn't it going forward, shouldn't we try to take preparedness outside of the political game in the sense of constitutionalizing some of the pandemic plans, some of the crucial key stocks that countries, individual governments, the EU must have in this respect. Also because the more we go into the pandemic and we understand we cannot tackle it as individual countries. Look at the European Union situation, and in terms of free movement of people, Schengen, potential temporary limitations, etc., etc. So I'm wondering whether what's going on shows that we should take out preparedness for public health emergencies from the democratic game and put it in a more constitutional level. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So there are no more questions. I think that Professor Maduro has at least 10-15 minutes to conclude. Please, Professor.
I don't think we need all that, because there were many points that were raised, but it would be impossible for me. It was both impossible for me to take note of all of them. It would be impossible for me to answer all of them. But I want to answer a few of them, that particularly those that raised questions to me that go beyond what we have in the book, and that sometimes somehow is linked to what has taken place since we have written the book. So I think it might be more interesting, so that maybe Giuseppe can then organize another workshop with all of us to discuss those issues.
I will.
I'm sure you're the person I trust for that. Not only for that, but also for that. Now, and some of them is questions that relate indeed to that issue of the extent to which this is a natural experiment on a global scale that we are still witnessing, and that empirically will provide and will continue to provide a lot of things for us to test. And I think some of the questions that are raised, the answers are still open and depend on what we will look at. Joelle, for example, was mentioning the extent to which more than the authoritarian character of regimes may be the degree of public trust that explains more or less successful policies in dealing with the pandemic. And when she was saying that, initially I was shaking my head and saying yes, and then a state name popped up my head, Sweden, and I said, well, maybe not exactly that. So again, there is an interesting question, and that I think will be one of the interesting empirical questions to look at. I mean, and probably the answer is that there's different variables, and those variables might explain, and that will be why it will be hard for us to draw conclusions, because it will be hard for us to determine correlation does not necessarily mean causality, particularly in the context where you have multiple variables playing a role in how successful you dealt with the pandemic, and how bad or how good were your results with respect to the pandemic. And again, this perhaps is linked to the question of this precautionary constitutionalism and preparedness. I think that's, on the one hand, that's a really interesting question, a question that somehow we were already addressing in the book. We really, I think a key aspect, the key core aspect of the book is the extent to which the pandemic should alert us to some things that go beyond the pandemics, that have to do with the extent to which our current politics underrepresents the scope of costs and benefits that ought to be taken into account, particular future and hypothetical risks. And so I think it's a huge effort that is required from constitutional lawyers, is to develop mechanisms in constitutional law that will force into political systems the incorporation of these systems, that represent the interests of future generations, but even sometimes may represent the interests of current generations that they are not aware of. That basically constitutional law should limit the risks of our irrational behavior. And to a large extent, we need to work on those mechanisms. What they are, I don't know. I mean, another interesting aspect of this is the extent to which politics was or not suspended during the pandemic. So there were countries where you continue to have a very strong vocal opposition. There were other ones where the approach and the political dynamics was, including my own, for example, that was very praised in the beginning because the opposition decided basically to remain silent and saying that they were there to cooperate with government and not to be critical, to give government basically more space to decide. But now, as the crisis become much worse in the third wave, you see on the one hand the risks that meant for the opposition, that is now made co-responsible when they don't want to assume that responsibility, because they say no, we were just giving the government more authority for it to decide what it wanted to do, but it is responsible for the current results. And the government saying no one said that we were acting wrongly, and on the contrary, now accusations. So one interesting thing is the extent to which we organize politics in those terms. And this might lead even to conclusions on how government should be organized during state of emergencies, for example, and then parliament should work or not work. Do we favor a working of parliament in this context that continues to play a very important scrutiny role and a vocal opposition role? Do we favor the opposite? Do we actually favor consensus, even the creation of national unity governments? Those are all very interesting questions. And these questions relate to the issue of the relationship with states of emergency that was mentioning. Now, there are two questions there, in my view, that are interesting and that were raised to some extent. One, and it's again something that I think we'll need to study to draw conclusions, is which systems fare better between systems that basically have in the Constitution itself clauses that create emergency regimes, states of emergency, and whereby the Constitution is, with respect to at least part of the rights and rules of the Constitution, suspended during that period, and those that instead of that have a tradition of interpreting not of suspending the application of constitutional rules, not of creating an exceptional regime, but of interpreting constitutional rules in times of emergency differently. And it will be interesting to see between those two regimes, constitutional regimes, which one will have translated in the medium long term to a stronger predominance of the interpretations of rule of emergency that were in practice during the period of emergency. So do constitutional regimes that involve states of emergency and the suspension of the Constitution in part more easily go back to a normal constitutional regime than constitutional regimes that are based on the interpretation of constitutional rules and therefore may end up spilling over to the normal state of constitutional affairs than the other ones, or vice versa. I think that will be something interesting to study. And again, we have to be careful because there may be other variables in play there too, but it was something to study. And then the other interesting thing indeed that was raised by Giuseppe is the question of the pandemic, whether states of emergency have been conceived for realities that are very different from the pandemic. My own country is a very good case of that. Because you see that we have a state of emergency, but the state of emergency does not allow to suspend or regulate political rights in any way. This meant that we are now in the process. We have presidential elections that will take place on Sunday, at the moment where we have the worst country in the world in terms of infected, and the second worst country in the world in terms of mortality rate. For the pandemic. So as you can imagine, this is having a huge impact on the campaign. We're having a political campaign that is in perfect tension, in permanent tension between a politician that organizes a political event and is criticized for that because we are in the worst moment ever of the pandemic, or not having anything, and then you have clearly favoring the incumbent. Even if in this case we were lucky enough, but simply is a matter of chance, that the current incumbent had accepted, for example, to have individual debates with all the candidates. And we are also, to some extent, lucky that everybody knows that he's going to win. So no one is paying much attention. But imagine that that was not the case. Imagine that it could be close. You will be having an election for President of the Republic with an incumbent that will be very strongly favored in such a context. And moreover, we may end up having elections this Sunday with abstentions rate of 70-75%. Some people fear we're going to have that. So we'll have a president being elected by 25% of the population. And the Constitution did not make it possible to delay, for example, the date of the elections. So this is a good example of the kind of tensions that Giuseppe was raising, of the extent to which our states of emergency laws and constitutional provisions do not foresee health emergencies. They were thought for other regimes, and therefore they were thought for a context where political practice that involves socialization to a large extent depends, socialization is put into question by the reality of this health emergency. So that will be an interesting question for the future, because I mean, many people say that unfortunately having more pandemics may be something that we have to get used to, because of the changes in living habits in certain parts of the world, where people that used to live in kind of rural and with animals are increasingly moving into urban areas, increasing the risks of transmission from animals and wild animals to humans. And therefore, let's hope that's not the case. But some people say that this might be an additional risk. Now, just one final point. I said that I was not going to take the minutes, but instead I'm taking it. Just a final point on the disinformation. I mean, I think that there's two approaches to that. Very briefly, one is the regulatory approach, and the other one is to try to make the democratic system more resilient. How? By reinforcing protecting traditional media, increasing fact-checking, and all, increasing media literacy. So you have to work of both. But I just wanted to conclude that at the level of the regulation, I think one of the things that we need to do is to perhaps impose and deal with digital platforms as essential facilities. And in this context, for example, a proposal that I've made is that they ought to be required to offer a plurality of algorithms. Some of them, so for example, if the New York Times would want to organize a competitive algorithm, that they should be able to offer that algorithm to the users of Facebook, and I might want my feed in Facebook to be the result of an algorithm that is organized by a media consortium than the algorithm of Facebook itself. I think it would be very interesting if we create that kind of competition for algorithms, some of them that may feed and promote pluralism instead of informational bubbles, and some of them that may provide much stronger editing. And if you then have that, then the fact that you will have editing and some people, for example, deciding that some sites will not be shown and others not, will be much more acceptable. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Maduro, for your final remarks. It's clear, crystal clear, at least to me, that there is enough room for another couple of books about these topics and issues. I really appreciated all your speeches. I've learned a lot, especially from a private lawyer as me. And I think that this seminar has been very, very, very fruitful for all of us and all the people on the screens. I would like just to thank you, all the speakers, Professor Maduro, Professor Baraggia, Professor Grogan, Professor Jakab, and Professor Martinico. I think that Giuseppe Martinico is ready to explain to us all future seminars and webinars that are foreseen in the next 6 months. We know how much productive is Sant'Anna Legal Studies, but it's time to go. It's time to close this fantastic webinar, and I really would like to give the final few words to Giuseppe and to Antonia, who are the host of this seminar. Please, Giuseppe, Antonia.
Well, just to say thank you very much. I think it was such a great webinar, and probably you're right. I mean, we need, to organize such another webinar for the follow-up, to this book. So this is a promise. So I'm sure that Miguel will be happy to have another round of comments, from all of us. And that's all. So thanks indeed, Raffaele, and thanks to the participants.
Antonia, some few words?
Just, I concur with Giuseppe. So thank you, everyone. And I look forward to discuss again on this topic that will keep us busy for the next decades, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody.
And